When people talk about ancient Egypt, the conversation often turns mysterious. How did they cut hard stone? How did they make straight lines? How did they move massive blocks without wheels or horses? The implication is usually the same. This couldn't have been done with ordinary tools. In this episode, we're stepping away from symbolism and belief systems and focusing on materials, tools, and process. How Egyptian art and architecture were actually made by human beings using methods we can understand, document, and even reproduce today. These methods have been tested repeatedly through experimental archaeology, using the same materials the ancient Egyptians had, and they work. No hidden technology, no lost science, just craft, labor, and time. As with all ancient technologies, methods varied over time and place, but principles remain consistent. Every artistic tradition is shaped by its materials. Egypt had some wood, but not large, straight, high-quality timber. Local woods like palm and acacia were short-grained and limited in size. As a result, most everyday buildings were made of mud brick, while elite and eternal projects were made in stone. High-quality wood, especially cedar, had to be imported by sea from the port city of Byblos in the Lebanon region. And because it was expensive, it was reserved for ships, coffins, doors, and luxury furniture. Egypt looks like a stone civilization not because Egyptians rejected wood, but because wood was scarce, imported, and used strategically. Stone, on the other hand, was abundant. Alongside copper, Egyptians also relied heavily on stone tools, especially flint chisels, which often held sharper edges than metal for carving soft stone. Some stones like limestone, sandstone, and alabaster are relatively soft and easy to carve. Others like granite, quartzite, anorthosite gneiss are extremely durable and were reserved for royal statues, obelisks, and sarcophagi. Hard stone did not mean impossible stone. It means different techniques. The most useful way to understand Egyptian making methods is to think in terms of subtractive and additive processes. Subtractive processes remove material to create form, carving away stone to reveal an image. Artists laid out guidelines, roughed out the form, refined the details, smoothed and polished the surface, and then added paint or inlay if needed. Additive processes work in the opposite direction. Instead of removing material, you build it up or assemble it. Many Egyptian artworks were composites, a wooden core covered with gesso, a smooth plaster-like coating, then paint or gold leaf with inlays of stone or glass. Once you see this distinction, a lot of the confusion disappears. A common claim goes like this: copper tools can't cut granite. That's true, and also beside the point. Egyptians did not rely on chisels alone to shape hard stone. They used two main techniques. The first was pounding. Hard stone pounders, often made of diorite, were used to gradually break down surfaces. This is slow, it's loud, it works. The second technique was abrasion. When Egyptians drilled or sawed stone, the metal tool did not cut the rock, the sand did. Quartz sand is harder than granite. Sand mixed with water does the cutting. A copper tool doesn't slice granite. It holds and guides the abrasive that actually wears the stone away. These experiments have been carried out most thoroughly by experimental archaeologist Dennis Stocks. And the same techniques continue to be demonstrated by independent researchers today. This method was used for drilling, sawing, smoothing, and polishing. Hollow copper tube drills leave behind cylindrical, striated stone cores, and those cores still exist. The tool shaped the cut, the abrasive did the work. Tool marks left by these processes are still visible today. These marks match what we see when the same methods are reproduced experimentally today. It requires time, labor, and control. Granite cutting was extraordinarily slow, measured in inches per day, not blocks per hour, which only makes sense when you account for decades of construction time. Straight lines are not mysterious. Egyptian builders used string lines pulled tight, plumb bobs to establish true verticals, squares for right angles, standardized measuring rods based on the royal cubit, the length of a forearm. Everything was measured, checked, and rechecked. A straight line is simply a string under tension. To create level surfaces, builders filled shallow trenches with water, which naturally finds a true horizontal. This method is simple and still used in surveying today. Circles were laid out using a fixed point and a measuring radius, a peg and a string. Cutting circular forms again relied on abrasion, not slicing. The Egyptian canon of proportions was not abstract philosophy. The grid was drawn directly onto plaster or stone. Its standardized figures across generations allowed teams to work consistently and reduced ritual error. This wasn't about creativity, it was about repeatability. In a culture where images had power, correctness mattered more than originality. Egyptian art was never meant to be colorless. Pigments came from minerals, red and yellow ochre, carbon black, white gypsum, and copper-based blues and greens. These minerals were ground into powder and mixed with organic binders before being applied. A binder is what holds pigment together and allows paint to stick to a surface. Common binders included plant gums, animal glue, or egg, depending on the material being painted. Paint was functional, not decorative. Color made images legible and effective in low-light ritual spaces. Egyptian faience is not clay. It's made from crushed quartz that was fired to create a shiny, glass-like surface, usually colored blue-green with copper compounds. It was used for amulets, tiles, and small ritual objects. Glass appears earlier as imports, but by the New Kingdom, Egypt became a major glass producer. Glass was rare and expensive, used mainly for small luxury objects rather than everyday containers. Now let's talk about metals, because this is another place where people assume the Egyptians shouldn't have been able to do what they did. Egypt used copper very early and copper alloys throughout its history. Tin bronze became increasingly common later, especially by the Middle and New Kingdoms. But it's important to understand something. Stone tools did not disappear. Diorite balls and flint chisels remained essential for carving and detailing soft stone because stone tools often held sharper edges longer than copper. Even when metal tools existed, Egyptians still used stone tools when stone was the best tool for the job. One small but important detail: some early Egyptian copper tools weren't chemically pure. Many contained trace amounts of arsenic from the ores themselves. That made the copper slightly harder and more durable than pure copper, better at holding an edge. This wasn't a miracle material and it didn't replace stone tools, but it did help copper chisels last longer, especially in soft stone and finishing work. Copper was available locally. Egypt mined copper in places like the Sinai Peninsula, the Eastern Desert, and Nubia, which supplied tools, weapons, and workshop equipment. Tin, however, was not available in Egypt. To make bronze, tin had to be imported through long-distance trade networks, likely from regions such as Anatolia and the Iranian Plateau. That's one reason bronze appears later and more gradually in Egyptian history. It depended on trade. Gold was different. Unlike many materials, Egypt did not rely on imports for gold. And gold wasn't just a material, it was a royal resource. Gold mattered because of what it does not do. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't tarnish, it doesn't decay. When I say gold lasts unchanged, I mean it doesn't chemically react much with the air or water the way most metals do. Iron rusts, copper turns green, silver darkens. Gold stays gold. To the Egyptians, that made it the perfect material for expressing eternity, and it's why they called gold the flesh of the gods, especially the sun god Ra. Stone lasts, but gold stays visually the same over time. That distinction mattered. Gold is a soft metal, which makes it easy to work. Egyptian craftspeople could hammer it into thin sheets, cut and shape it, and press it over carved surfaces. They could attach it using resins, rivets, or other adhesives depending on the object. This process is gilding, gold leafing. And here's the key point. Most Egyptian objects were not solid gold. They were composites, a wooden core covered in gesso, then gold leaf on the surface, often with inlays of glass or stone. Gold was used where it mattered most, on the surface, where light and meaning did the work. Gold wasn't only valuable, it was functional. In dark temples lit by oil lamps, or in chambers where a narrow sunbeam entered at the right moment, gold reflected and flickered. That movement of light could make faces appear animated, almost alive. This effect wasn't accidental. Gold helped statues perform their role as living vessels for divine presence. This is where speculation often enters, so let's be clear. The wheel is not automatically the best solution for heavy transport. In Old Kingdom Egypt, there were no horses, no paved roads, and the ground itself was soft sand and silt. Wheeled carts would have sunk and failed under extreme weight. Instead, Egyptians used wooden sledges placed directly under stone blocks. People often imagine all that weight resting on a few wooden beams, but that's not how it worked. A sledge spreads weight the same way snowshoes spread a person's weight on snow. The load isn't concentrated, it's distributed. A tank weighing 60 tons doesn't sink into the ground, its treads spread the force. Egyptian sledges did the same thing, only deliberately and at a much larger scale. Even the largest statues, like the colossal Ramses figure at the Ramesseum, weighing close to 1,000 tons, weren't lifted or carried in the air. They were moved the same way: distributed load, sledges, prepared ground, and time. These sledges were pulled by coordinated teams using ropes and moved along prepared paths. This wasn't improvisation, it was engineering adapted to the environment. Pouring water in front of the sled dampened and compacted the sand, preventing it from piling up in front of the runners. That simple step reduced friction dramatically. Experimental archaeology shows that under the right conditions, this can cut the pulling force by nearly half. A typical pyramid block weighs about 2 to 3 tons. That's heavy, but manageable for coordinated human labor. These stones were not moved by heroic individuals or superhuman strength. They were moved by teams working in parallel over long periods of time. What mattered was not raw strength, but coordination. You'll sometimes hear claims that the pyramids required placing a block every few seconds. That idea assumes only one block was being worked on at a time. In reality, thousands of blocks were being quarried, hauled, positioned, and finished simultaneously across different locations over decades. Once you understand that, the math stops being mysterious. Most stone did not travel long distances over land. It moved by boat along the Nile and through canals built specifically for transport. Many of these canals have since silted up or disappeared entirely, but archaeological and textual evidence shows they once brought stone remarkably close to construction sites. Only the final stage involved hauling stone over land. This is why quarries were chosen for water access whenever possible. The Diary of Mur, the oldest known written logbook, records limestone shipped by boat from the Tura quarries to Giza. The stone wasn't dragged across deserts, it floated. We don't know the exact ramp system used to build the pyramids, and that's okay. What we do know is simple. Egyptians had ramps, they had levers, and they had time. A lever works by pivoting a beam over a support point, called a fulcrum. By pushing down on the long end, workers could raise heavy stone blocks a small amount at a time, just enough to position them accurately. Different ramp systems were likely used at different stages of construction. These are not competing fantasies. They are practical solutions adapted to changing conditions as the structure rose. Final positioning was slow, careful work, measured in inches, not meters. Some elements could not be added later at all. Granite sarcophagi, because of their massive size, had to be installed during construction, before passages were closed and upper courses completed. These were not objects you could fix later. Once they were in place, they were meant to remain there permanently. Egypt's greatest technology was not mechanical, it was social. Workers were skilled specialists, housed and fed by the state, and organized into rotating crews. We know their names, we know their schedules, we know what they ate. Many of these workers were buried in cemeteries beside the pyramids themselves, an honor no enslaved population would have received. Speculative explanations usually ignore one thing: time. Egyptian monuments were built over decades, sometimes generations. When you account for abrasion instead of cutting, boats instead of carts, organization instead of brute force, and years instead of days, the mystery disappears, and the real story is better. Ancient Egyptian art is not mysterious because it was unknowable. It feels mysterious because it was patient, methodical, and uninterested in spectacle. No hidden machines, no lost science, no supernatural shortcuts. Just people measuring, checking, correcting, repeating, year after year. And that is far more impressive than mystery.